I used to believe that I had everything under control. That I was the master of my own world, my own desires. I convinced myself that I could keep all the pieces of my life exactly where I wanted them, balanced, untouched, perfect. And Ethan? My devoted, predictable husband? He was never supposed to notice a thing. For years, our marriage was routine. Comfortable. I knew the exact rhythm of Ethan's life, his morning coffee at precisely 6:30 a.m., his obsessive need to check work emails before breakfast, the way he always parked his car in the exact same spot in our driveway. He was stability personified. A man who never wavered, never questioned, never strayed from the path he had set for himself. And that's why I thought I could get away with it. At first, it wasn't even about cheating. It was about excitement. I had been suffocating under the weight of predictability, drowning in the monotony of a life I had chosen too young. Ethan was safe. He was good. And maybe, for a time, I even loved him. But as the years passed, I began to crave something else, something dangerous, something that made me feel alive again. That's when I met Daniel. Daniel was nothing like Ethan. He was reckless, spontaneous, and utterly intoxicating. We met at a friend's dinner party, a night I had nearly skipped because Ethan had been too busy with work to bother coming along. But I went anyway. And there he was, leaning against the bar, dark eyes scanning the room like he owned it. When he smiled at me, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. A spark. It started small. Flirting. Texting. A little stolen excitement to remind myself that I was still desirable, still wanted. But Daniel was persuasive. He knew how to make me forget about caution, how to make me crave more. The first time I met him at a hotel, I told myself it would be a one-time thing. A mistake. But one time became two, then three. And soon, I was living two lives, one as Ethan's loving wife, and another as Daniel's secret obsession. And Ethan? He was still as blind as ever. The best part was that I didn't even have to lie that much. He never pressed, never suspected. If I said I was having a girls' night, he believed me. If I came home late, claiming I'd lost track of time, he would kiss my forehead and tell me to get some rest. He was the perfect husband for someone like me, someone who needed freedom. I started to enjoy the thrill of it all. How easy it was. I laughed about it sometimes when I was with Daniel, mocking how clueless Ethan was. How he'd never suspect that his wife, his loyal, devoted wife, was sneaking around behind his back. But then, everything changed. It was a Saturday night, and Ethan was in his office, working late like always. I had just finished talking to Daniel on the phone, whispering sweet promises about our next meeting, when I heard a soft creak behind me. My heart stopped. I turned to find Ethan standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Who were you talking to?" he asked, his voice calm. Too calm. My stomach twisted, but I forced a laugh. "Just Claire. She's having another meltdown about her boyfriend." Ethan stared at me for a long moment, and for the first time, I felt something unsettling. Something I had never seen in him before. A quiet, knowing suspicion. "Right," he said finally. And then he just walked away. No argument. No accusations. Just silence. That was the moment I realized something had shifted. Ethan wasn't as blind as I had always believed. And I had no idea what that meant for me. The moment Ethan walked away that night, something shifted in me. It wasn't fear. Not at first. I told myself I was overthinking it. Ethan was the same as he had always been, calm, trusting, predictable. The kind of man who assumed the best in people, who never read too much into anything. He worked late, buried himself in projects, and rarely questioned what I did with my time. And yet, something about the way he looked at me before he left the room made my stomach knot in a way I didn't like. I sat there for a while, phone still clutched in my hand, listening to the faint sound of him moving around the house. His footsteps were slow, deliberate. Like he was thinking. And for the first time in years, I felt unsteady. I should have gone to him. Made a joke. Kissed him. Given him something to reassure him, to pull him back into the comforting illusion we had built together. But instead, I sat frozen, my mind racing. Ethan had never asked me a question like that before. Not once. Who were you talking to? It wasn't an accusation, but it wasn't nothing either. And I knew, deep down, that he hadn't believed me. By the time I finally gathered myself enough to move, he had already gone to bed. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom, watching him lie there, back turned to me. His breathing was steady, his body relaxed, but I knew he wasn't asleep. Ethan always fell asleep on his right side, facing the window. Not like this. I climbed into bed slowly, sliding beneath the covers, my heart pounding harder than I wanted to admit. I almost reached for him. Almost whispered his name. But something held me back. Instead, I turned onto my own side, staring into the darkness, willing myself to believe that everything was fine. That he hadn't figured anything out. That he never would. The next morning, Ethan was normal. Or at least, close enough to it that I could pretend nothing had changed. He got up at his usual time, made his usual coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with his laptop open, reviewing emails. If anything was different, it was subtle. He didn't greet me with his usual kiss on the cheek, but that was easy enough to blame on morning grogginess. I moved through the kitchen, pouring myself coffee, trying to act natural. Trying to pretend the unease from the night before had been nothing more than a figment of my imagination. So, you working late again tonight? I asked casually, leaning against the counter. Ethan didn't look up from his screen. No. That was it. No explanation. No follow-up. Just a single syllable that felt heavier than it should have. I forced a smile. Wow. A rare sighting of my husband before midnight? Should I be honored? He glanced at me then, just for a second, before returning his focus to his laptop. Figured I'd switch things up, he murmured. Something about the way he said it made my stomach tighten again. I didn't push. I didn't dare. Instead, I sat down across from him and scrolled mindlessly through my phone, sipping my coffee, pretending like nothing was wrong. But I could feel it. There was a shift in the air. A crack in the glass. And no matter how much I tried to ignore it, I knew Ethan wasn't as blind as I had always believed. I met Daniel that afternoon. We had gotten careless, I realized. The thrill of secrecy had made us bold. We met in hotels now, in bars on the other side of town. We lingered too long in places we had no business being together. But that day, as I slid into the passenger seat of his car, I felt none of the usual excitement. My mind was still stuck on Ethan. Daniel noticed immediately. What's wrong? He asked, reaching over to tuck a strand of hair behind my ear. You look like you've seen a ghost. I forced a laugh, shaking my head. It's nothing. Just. Ethan was acting weird this morning. Daniel frowned. Weird how? I hesitated. I don't know. Just off. Like he was watching me. Like he knew something. A slow smirk spread across Daniel's face. You're just being paranoid. You said it yourself, your husband never suspects anything. He's oblivious. The way he said it, so casual, so dismissive, should have reassured me. After all, he was right, wasn't he? Ethan had never questioned me before. But for some reason, the words felt different now. You're probably right, I muttered. Daniel grinned, leaning in closer. Of course I am. Now, let's stop talking about your husband. He kissed me then, pulling me into him, and for a moment, I let myself get lost in it. Let myself believe that everything was fine. That I was still in control. That night, when I came home, Ethan was already there. Sitting in the living room. Waiting. The second I stepped through the door, he looked up at me, his expression unreadable. "Good time with Claire?" he asked, his voice too smooth. Too calm. I froze. And in that moment, I knew I had made a mistake. Ethan wasn't blind anymore. He was watching. And I had no idea what he was going to do next. The moment I stepped through the door and saw Ethan sitting there, waiting, my heart stuttered in my chest. He had never done this before. Normally, he'd be in his office, buried in emails, or in the bedroom, unwinding after a long day. But tonight, he was sitting in the living room, one arm draped over the back of the couch, his expression unreadable. And then he spoke. "Good time with Claire?" His voice was smooth, casual even, but there was an undercurrent of something else. Something cold. Calculated. I had to think fast. I let out a small laugh, shaking my head as I dropped my purse onto the console table. "Oh, God, you have no idea. She spent the entire time complaining about Derek again. Swear to God, I don't know why she stays with that man." Ethan didn't respond right away. He just watched me. Something about that silence made my skin crawl. I forced myself to walk toward the kitchen, pretending like everything was normal. "You ate already?" I called over my shoulder. "Or should I make something?" "Had leftovers." Another short, clipped response. I was grasping for any sign of normalcy, but it was slipping through my fingers fast. I grabbed a glass from the cabinet, filling it with water just to have something to do with my hands. My fingers were shaking slightly, so I took a deep breath and forced myself to calm down. He didn't know. He couldn't know. I had been careful. I turned back to face him, glass in hand, and leaned against the counter. "You're home early," I said, hoping to turn the attention away from me. Ethan tilted his head slightly, as if he was considering something. Then he smiled. It wasn't his usual smile. I figured I'd switch things up. That same phrase. The one from this morning. I swallowed hard. For the next few days, Ethan didn't mention it again. He went back to his usual routine: work, emails, late nights in his office. And just like that, I started to believe I had imagined everything. That maybe I had just been paranoid. That maybe he really was still blind. But then, little things started happening. Small, almost insignificant things that should have meant nothing, except they didn't feel like nothing. I started noticing the way he would glance at me when he thought I wasn't looking. The way he'd pause just a second too long before responding to something I said. And then there was his phone. Ethan had never been glued to his phone before. He used it for work, sure, but he wasn't the type to constantly check it. But now? I'd catch him staring at his screen, scrolling, reading. And then there was the locked drawer. Ethan had a filing cabinet in his office where he kept important documents. It had always been unlocked, until now. One evening, after Ethan had gone for a late-night drive, another thing he never used to do, I found myself standing in front of that drawer. Something was inside. Something he didn't want me to see. I tested the handle, finding it locked tight. My pulse quickened. I knew where he kept the key, top left drawer of his desk. My fingers trembled as I pulled it open, digging through paper clips and receipts until my hand closed around cool metal. I hesitated. I could still walk away. Pretend like I didn't notice. But I didn't. I slid the key into the lock, turned it, and pulled the drawer open. And my stomach dropped. Inside was a thick manila folder. My name was written on the tab. Heart pounding, I flipped it open, my breath catching in my throat as I saw what was inside. Pictures. Of me. With Daniel. Some from restaurants. Some from hotel parking lots. Some of us in his car, close, too close. I felt like the air had been knocked out of me. My hands shook as I flipped through them, my mind racing. When had he gotten these? How had he gotten these? But that wasn't the worst part. The last page in the folder wasn't a picture. It was a printout of a plane ticket. A one-way ticket. In Ethan's name. I stared at it, my vision blurring. He was planning to leave. He knew. And he was going to leave me. Panic surged through me like wildfire. No. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. I was supposed to be the one in control. I was supposed to make the decisions. Not Ethan. Never Ethan. I slammed the drawer shut, locking it back before shoving the key into its place. My pulse was racing, my mind spinning in 100 different directions. I had to do something. I had to stop him. Ethan could not leave me. I wouldn't allow it. That night, I slipped into bed beside him, pressing my body close. His back was turned to me, like it had been for the past few nights. I ran my fingers along his arm, pressing a soft kiss to his shoulder. I miss you, I whispered. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, finally, he let out a breath. Do you? I forced myself to nod against his skin. Of course I do. He was quiet for so long I thought maybe he had fallen asleep. But then, just as I was starting to relax, he spoke. Then why do you smell like someone else's cologne? My entire body went rigid. My breath caught in my throat. I had scrubbed myself raw in the shower. Changed clothes. There was no way. Ethan finally turned to face me. In the dim light, I could barely make out his expression. But his eyes. His eyes told me everything. He knew. I had lost control. And for the first time since this all started, I felt something I hadn't felt before. Fear. Ethan's words hung in the air like a noose tightening around my throat. Then why do you smell like someone else's cologne? Every nerve in my body screamed at me to stay calm. To laugh it off. To play dumb. But I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I had scrubbed myself raw in the shower before coming home. Changed into fresh clothes. Spritzed my usual perfume just in case. There was no way he could smell Daniel on me. Unless. Had I missed something? Had I been careless? Ethan's gaze was steady, unblinking, waiting. Testing. I forced a soft laugh and sat up slightly, running a hand through my hair as if shaking off the absurdity of the accusation. What are you talking about? I murmured, keeping my voice light. I was with Claire. Maybe it rubbed off from a hug or something. Ethan didn't answer right away. His face was unreadable. You think I don't know what your perfume smells like? His voice was quiet, too quiet. You've worn the same one for years. My skin prickled. This wasn't the Ethan I knew. The Ethan I had spent years molding into a man who never questioned me. This was someone else. Someone sharper. Someone dangerous. I needed to end this. Now. I sighed, shaking my head like he was being ridiculous. Ethan, seriously? You're acting weird. I reached out, letting my fingers trail over his arm, a familiar move that always softened him. Is something wrong? For a moment, I thought it worked. He exhaled, his body relaxing slightly. Then, just as quickly, he shifted away from me. I've just been thinking a lot, he said, staring at the ceiling. About us. About everything. A warning bell went off in my mind. What do you mean? I asked, my voice carefully controlled. He let out a slow breath, his fingers drumming against the blanket. Do you ever feel like we've drifted? I swallowed hard. I don't know. Maybe a little? I forced a small, sad smile. But every marriage goes through phases. You've been working late. I've been busy. We just need to reconnect. It was a well-rehearsed lie. One I had told myself so many times that I almost believed it. Ethan turned his head to look at me. Is that what you want? My heart pounded. Of course. He studied me for a long moment before nodding. Then let's try. Try. That single word sent a rush of relief through me. This was salvageable. I could fix this. I leaned in again, pressing my lips to his shoulder. I'd like that, I whispered. Ethan didn't pull away this time. But he also didn't touch me back. And that was the second warning. The next day, I told Daniel we needed to slow things down. His reaction was exactly what I expected: frustration, disbelief. What the hell, Lauren, he scoffed, leaning back in the driver's seat as we sat parked in a quiet lot on the other side of town. I thought you wanted this. I do, I said quickly. But Ethan's acting weird. I think he's starting to suspect something. I just need to smooth things over, and then we can go back to normal. Daniel huffed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. He's not a problem. He never has been. I looked away, chewing my lip. He's different now. He's watching me. So what? Daniel leaned closer, his voice dropping. You think he's suddenly gonna grow a spine? He's just having a moment of insecurity. Ride it out, and he'll go back to being clueless. I wanted to believe that. I needed to believe that. Just give me a little space, I said, forcing a smile. I'll fix things. Daniel exhaled sharply but nodded. Fine. But don't keep me waiting too long. He leaned in, kissing me hard, possessively, before I could pull away. My body responded out of habit, but my mind was somewhere else. Because deep down, I knew Daniel was wrong. Ethan wasn't just having a moment of insecurity. Something had changed. That night, Ethan was waiting for me again. Not in the living room this time, but in the kitchen. I had barely closed the front door when I saw him sitting at the table, a folder in front of him. My blood ran cold. The folder. My folder. The one I had found in his office. I forced my feet to move, approaching slowly. What's that? I asked, nodding toward it. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He just tapped a finger against the cover. You tell me, he finally said. I stared at him, my pulse thudding painfully in my throat. I have no idea what you're talking about. His lips twitched in something that almost looked like amusement. Lauren. He sighed, shaking his head. Come on. Let's not do this. Do what? I folded my arms. He exhaled again, then flipped open the folder. The pictures stared back at me. Me. With Daniel. In a hotel parking lot. In his car. At the restaurant where we thought no one would see us. I felt the blood drain from my face. Ethan tilted his head, watching me. Now, do you want to try telling the truth? I scrambled for something, anything that could get me out of this. Anger. That was my best bet. I snatched up the photos, my hands trembling. You've been spying on me? I demanded. Going through my things? Following me? Ethan just stared, unfazed. Interesting reaction. I clenched my jaw. You went through my private life. He let out a low chuckle. Your private life? That's what we're calling it now? My hands tightened around the photos. This is sick, Ethan. This is why I've been pulling away, because you don't trust me. You're paranoid. You. Stop. The single word cut through my rant like a knife. Ethan stood, slowly, pressing his palms against the table. You don't get to flip this on me, Lauren. Not this time. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't throwing things or demanding explanations. He was calm. Too calm. And that scared me more than anything. He grabbed the folder, tucking it under his arm. I'm done playing dumb. His voice was quiet but firm. Now, you have two choices. You tell me the truth, or you find out what happens when I stop caring. Panic gripped my chest. He was serious. He wasn't just thinking about leaving me. He was leaving me. And for the first time since this all started, I realized something. I wasn't the one in control anymore. Ethan was. And I had no idea what he was going to do next. Had spent years perfecting my control over Ethan, shaping him into the kind of man who never questioned me, never looked too closely. And yet, here he was, standing in front of me, the manila folder clutched under his arm, waiting for me to speak. You tell me the truth, or you find out what happens when I stop caring. His voice was calm, steady. But there was something in his eyes I didn't recognize. Something final. I needed to act fast. I straightened my shoulders, forcing a slow breath through my nose. Ethan, I don't know what you think you saw, but this isn't what it looks like. He exhaled a short laugh. Not amused. Not angry. Just tired. Lauren, he said, shaking his head. Don't. Just don't. My pulse hammered in my throat. This wasn't working. The old tricks, the deflection, the gaslighting, the tears if necessary, none of it was working. Ethan wasn't taking the bait. For the first time, I felt truly, completely cornered. So I did the only thing I could think of. I went on the attack. I crossed my arms, glaring at him. How did you even get these pictures? Huh? Did you hire someone to follow me? Go through my things? That's insane, Ethan. This is what's wrong with our marriage. His expression didn't change. Nice try, he said flatly. That was it. No outrage. No defensive rambling. No accusations. Just two simple words that sent ice down my spine. I gritted my teeth. This is why I started pulling away from you, I spat. This controlling, obsessive behavior. You don't even see what you've become. Ethan studied me for a moment, then stepped away from the table, running a hand down his jaw. You know, Lauren, he murmured, I always thought I was a smart guy. Maybe not the most exciting. Maybe a little too predictable. But smart. I swallowed hard. I didn't like where this was going. His eyes flicked to mine, sharp, cutting. But you made me feel like an idiot. My stomach twisted. He let out a slow breath, shaking his head. And I let you. His words hit me like a slap. This wasn't like before. Ethan wasn't playing the victim. He wasn't begging for explanations or demanding apologies. He had already made up his mind. I opened my mouth, desperate to say something, anything that could undo this, but before I could speak, Ethan reached into the folder and pulled out something else. A sheet of paper. He placed it on the table and slid it toward me. I glanced down. And my blood ran cold. Divorce papers. For a long moment, I just stared at them. My body refused to move. My brain refused to process. This wasn't supposed to happen. Ethan wasn't supposed to do this. I forced myself to look up, my voice barely above a whisper. You're divorcing me? Ethan exhaled, rubbing the bridge of his nose. I should have done this a long time ago. The floor beneath me seemed to tilt. I clutched the edge of the table, my breath coming in shallow bursts. Ethan, wait. We can talk about this. There's nothing to talk about. His voice was firm, unwavering. I'm done, Lauren. No. No, no, no. I had spent so long believing Ethan would never leave me. That I had shaped him into someone who would tolerate anything just to keep the life we built. But I had underestimated him. And now, I was losing. I needed to change tactics. Fast. I softened my expression, stepping closer. Ethan, please. I swallowed, forcing tears into my voice. I made a mistake. A huge mistake. But I love you. I always have. It was never about. Stop. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through me like a blade. He was done. Actually done. The realization sent me spiraling. I had played this game for so long, convinced that I was always one step ahead, that Ethan was nothing more than a pawn in my life. But I had miscalculated. I had pushed too far. And now, I was about to lose everything. The days that followed were a blur of panic. Ethan didn't just leave. He disappeared. No warning. No goodbye. One morning, I woke up and found his closet empty. His car gone. And the worst part? He didn't fight me. No screaming matches. No ugly confrontations. No drawn-out, messy battles. Just silence. Like I didn't even matter. I called him. No answer. I texted. No reply. I reached out to his colleagues, his friends, even his family. Nobody knew where he was. Or if they did, they weren't telling me. And then, slowly, the walls started closing in. At first, I told myself I would be fine. I had a life of my own. My own friends. My own independence. But things unraveled faster than I ever expected. Money started disappearing from our joint accounts. Ethan had moved it before leaving. Our house? The one I had assumed was ours? It turned out Ethan had been making the mortgage payments alone for the past year. His name was the only one on the deed. The car I drove? In his name. The credit cards I used? All under his account. It was like I had spent years living in a life that wasn't actually mine. And now, it was slipping through my fingers. I was scrambling, trying to find some kind of footing when the final blow came. Daniel. I had assumed he would be my safety net, the person I could fall back on now that Ethan was gone. But Daniel had never been the kind of man to stick around when things got complicated. When he realized I no longer had access to Ethan's money, he disappeared too. No calls. No messages. Nothing. One day, I showed up at his place, desperate, needing someone to tell me everything was going to be okay. But his neighbor told me he had moved out a week ago. No forwarding address. No explanation. He was gone. Just like Ethan. And just like that, I had nothing. Sitting alone in an empty house that didn't even belong to me, I finally understood something. Ethan hadn't just left me. He had watched, quietly, as the life I had built for myself collapsed. And then he had walked away, letting it all burn. I had always thought I was the one in control. That he was the fool. But in the end, I was the one who had been played. I used to think I was untouchable. For years, I had built my life exactly the way I wanted, balancing my comfortable marriage with Ethan and the reckless thrill of Daniel. I had mastered the art of deception, manipulating situations, bending the truth to suit me. And yet, in the span of a few weeks, everything crumbled. Ethan didn't just leave, he erased me from his life. And worse, he had done it so smoothly, so quietly, that by the time I realized what had happened, I was already drowning. I spent the first few days after his disappearance in denial. I told myself this was just some kind of stunt. A power move. That Ethan would come back once he cooled off, and I would smooth things over, just like I always had. But as the days passed, reality sank in. He wasn't coming back. He wasn't answering my calls. His accounts were locked down. And one by one, I started losing everything I had once taken for granted. The first thing to go was the house. I had assumed that, no matter what happened, it would at least be mine. I had lived here for years. decorated it, made it a home. But when I received the official foreclosure notice in the mail, I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. Ethan had stopped paying the mortgage the second he left. The house was solely in his name, something I had never even considered a possibility. Now, it was being taken away. I had 30 days to vacate. Panic gripped me like a vice. I scrambled, trying to find a way to fix it. I went to the bank, hoping there was something I could do, some account that I still had access to. But Ethan had been thorough. Any joint accounts we had? Closed. Any savings I had relied on? Gone. The only money I had left was whatever was in my personal checking account, which, considering I hadn't had a real job in years, wasn't much. I had spent so long relying on Ethan's stability, his paycheck, his carefully maintained finances. And now, with a single decision, he had pulled the rug out from under me. I tried reaching out to his friends. His family. No one would talk to me. It was as if I had never existed in his life. Like he had wiped me clean. I was losing everything, and I had nowhere to turn. I had always thought, if worse came to worst, that Daniel would be there. That was our plan. If things with Ethan ever truly fell apart, I would have Daniel waiting, ready to pick up the pieces. But Daniel had vanished just as suddenly as Ethan. The messages stopped. The calls went to voicemail. And then, one day, I showed up at his apartment, desperate for something, some kind of reassurance, some kind of plan. But his apartment was empty. His neighbor told me he had moved out a week ago. A week ago. Right when Ethan had left me. My hands shook as I sat in my car outside Daniel's empty apartment, staring at the dark windows, feeling the weight of what had happened crash down on me. Daniel had never cared about me. He had cared about the affair. The thrill. The secrecy. The rush of sneaking around. But the second things got complicated, he ran. And I was left with nothing. I had spent so long believing that I was the one in control. That I was the one making all the moves. But the truth was clear now. I had been nothing more than a temporary distraction to Daniel. And I had been nothing more than an obligation to Ethan. And now that they were both gone, I had nothing left at all. The final blow came when I went to the only place I thought I could find help, my parents. It was humiliating. I had spent years proving that I was independent, that I had built a life that I controlled. I never asked them for anything after I married Ethan. I never needed to. But now, I was standing in their doorway, swallowing my pride, forcing a trembling smile as my mother opened the door. She took one look at me and sighed. Lauren. Something in her voice sent a rush of shame through me. I followed her inside, where my father was already seated at the kitchen table, arms crossed. So, he said, his voice gruff. How long before you tell us the truth? I frowned. What do you mean? He exchanged a glance with my mother. Then he slid his phone across the table toward me. My stomach dropped. On the screen was a news article. The headline made my blood run cold. Businessman Ethan Callaway quietly divorces wife amid infidelity scandal, friends say he's moved on. I grabbed the phone, my hands shaking as I read through the article. It detailed how Ethan had stepped away from his personal life after learning of my alleged long-term affair. It quoted anonymous sources claiming Ethan had suspected for months but had wanted to be sure before walking away. And worst of all, there was a photo of him. Smiling. Looking happy. Standing next to some woman I had never seen before, her hand resting casually on his arm. I couldn't breathe. This has been all over the place, my father muttered. And this is how we find out what you've been up to. My mother sighed, rubbing her temples. Lauren, we raised you better than this. The shame that rushed through me was unlike anything I had ever felt. I had spent so long convincing myself that I was the one in control. That I could manipulate my way through anything. But Ethan had beaten me at my own game. He hadn't just left. He had made sure the world knew why he had left. And now, I wasn't just alone. I was ruined. I had no money. No home. No lover to run to. And now, I didn't even have my family's support. My hands trembled as I shoved the phone away, blinking rapidly, trying to force back the tears. I had lost. I had truly lost. And worst of all? Ethan didn't even care enough to watch me fall. He had already moved on. And I was left with nothing but the wreckage of my own making. Always thought the worst thing that could happen to me was getting caught. But I was wrong. The worst thing that could happen was realizing that, after everything I had done, I wasn't important enough for Ethan to fight me. I had built a life where I thought I held all the power, where I dictated the rules and controlled the narrative. And yet, in the end, Ethan didn't rage. He didn't yell. He just left. And the silence he left behind was deafening. After the meeting with my parents, I drove aimlessly for hours. I didn't have a destination. I didn't have a home. The house that I had once called mine was already in the process of being foreclosed on. Ethan had made sure I had nothing left to hold on to. Even my parents, my last, desperate safety net, had barely looked at me as I walked out their door. "Lauren, we raised you better than this." Their disappointment felt like a knife in my chest. I didn't know where to go. I considered checking into a hotel, but I barely had enough money to last me the month. And, truthfully, I couldn't stomach the thought of sleeping in a place where the walls would close in on me, suffocating me in my own regret. So I went to the one place I hadn't allowed myself to think about. Claire's house. She opened the door, and the moment she saw me, her entire expression shifted. It wasn't the usual bright smile, the warmth I had taken for granted all these years. It was hesitation. Unease. I had seen that look on her face before, when she was dealing with someone she didn't quite trust. And now, she was looking at me that way. "Lauren," she said cautiously. "What are you doing here?" I forced a small laugh, trying to downplay the raw panic building in my chest. I was in the neighborhood and figured I'd drop by. Claire didn't move to let me in. She folded her arms. I saw the article. My stomach clenched. I should have known. Of course, she had seen it. Everyone had. I tried to laugh it off. You know how the media loves to exaggerate. But she didn't smile. She just stared at me for a long moment before finally stepping aside. "Come in." I walked inside, and for the first time in years, I felt like a stranger in my best friend's home. The couch, the decor, even the scent of vanilla candles, it was all familiar. Yet, nothing felt the same. I sat down, expecting her to join me, but she didn't. She stood across the room, arms crossed, studying me like I was a puzzle she no longer wanted to solve. "So," she said, "how much of it is true?" I swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" Claire sighed, rubbing her temple. "Lauren, don't do that. Don't act like I'm an idiot." My chest tightened. She knew. Or at the very least, she suspected. I hesitated, trying to figure out the best way to spin this, but Claire was already shaking her head. "Jesus," she muttered, "I always knew something was off. But I told myself it wasn't my place. That you'd tell me if something was wrong." "Claire, She held up a hand, cutting me off. "How long?" I clenched my jaw. "Claire, it's not." "How long, Lauren?" Her voice cracked. I let out a shaky breath. "Almost a year." The words hung between us like a death sentence. Claire exhaled sharply and turned away, pressing her fingers against her forehead. Unbelievable. I felt myself sinking deeper into the couch, the shame curling around me like a noose. "Claire, please." "It wasn't." Don't, she snapped, spinning around to face me. Don't try to justify it. I flinched. I had never seen her like this before. You lied to me. You used me. Every single time you said you were having dinner with me, was that a lie too? I opened my mouth, then closed it. Because I had used her. Whenever I needed an alibi, whenever Ethan casually asked, "Where were you?" Claire's name had always been the easiest answer. She let out a humorless laugh, shaking her head. And I defended you. When people asked where you were, I covered for you because I thought you were just overwhelmed or needed space. Her voice wavered. I trusted you. The weight of those words crushed me. You have no idea what you've done, she continued, her voice filled with something close to pity. You didn't just lose Ethan. You lost everything. I swallowed, my hands trembling in my lap. Claire, please. I don't have anywhere else to go. For the first time, her face softened. But not with sympathy. With regret. She exhaled slowly, like she was making a decision she didn't want to make. Then she shook her head. I can't help you, Lauren. A cold dread slithered down my spine. My throat tightened. Claire. I love you, she said softly. But I can't be part of this. You need to go. I stared at her, my vision blurring. You're kicking me out? I whispered. She looked away. I'm sorry. And just like that. The last person I had left was gone. I sat in my car for almost an hour, staring at the steering wheel, trying to convince myself this wasn't real. That Claire hadn't just turned me away. That my entire world hadn't just imploded. But it had. Ethan was gone. Daniel was gone. My home was gone. My money was gone. And now, the only friend I had ever truly trusted had turned her back on me, too. I had nothing. No one. And for the first time in my life, I felt something I never thought I would experience. True, undeniable loneliness. The kind that made my chest ache. The kind that made me realize just how deeply I had failed. For years, I had played the game, convincing myself that I would always be the one who walked away unscathed. But now, as I sat in my car, staring at the empty road ahead, I finally understood. I had been the fool all along. And there was no one left to save me. When I left Claire's house that night, I told myself I'd be fine. It was a lie. One of many I'd been telling myself for years. But this one? This one crumbled the moment I pulled out of her driveway, feeling more alone than I ever had in my life. The truth was simple, I had nowhere to go. No one to call. Nothing left. The car, Ethan's car, technically, was the only thing tethering me to what remained of my old life. But even that wouldn't last long. The repo papers had already come in the mail, another final nail in the coffin Ethan had quietly built around me. I drove aimlessly for hours, the city lights blurring as my thoughts spiraled. I wasn't thinking about where to go. I wasn't thinking at all. Because if I did think, I'd have to face the truth. I'd have to admit what I'd done. And worse, what I'd lost. By midnight, I found myself parked outside a rundown motel on the outskirts of town. It wasn't the kind of place I would have ever considered before. The flickering neon sign, the cracked windows, the chipped paint on the doors, all of it screamed desperation. But desperation was all I had left. I checked in with the last bit of money in my account, avoiding the front desk clerk's eyes as he slid the key across the counter. He didn't ask questions. Maybe he saw people like me all the time, people running from something, people who had nowhere else to go. The room was as bad as I expected. Faded floral bedspread. Stains on the carpet. A flickering light bulb that buzzed faintly overhead. I didn't care. I was too exhausted to care. I collapsed onto the sagging mattress, staring at the water-stained ceiling, and for the first time in weeks, the numbness cracked just enough for the weight of everything to hit me. And it hit hard. I had lost Ethan. I had lost Daniel. I had lost my home, my friends, my family, myself. The tears came fast, hot, and ugly. I didn't try to stop them. What was the point? There was no one left to pretend for. I woke up the next morning with a pounding headache and a hollow ache in my chest that felt like it would never go away. I didn't know what day it was. Didn't care. I was surviving minute by minute. I spent the next week in that motel room, barely eating, barely sleeping. I'd stare at my phone for hours, hoping, praying, for a message from Ethan. A call. Something. But it never came. Not from him. Not from Daniel. Not from anyone. The silence was suffocating. Eventually, reality crept back in. The motel bill was piling up, and I was running out of money. I needed a plan. But for the first time in my life, I had no idea what to do. I had always been able to talk my way out of anything, charm my way into people's good graces. But now, there was no one left to charm. No one left to manipulate. Just me. And the mess I'd made. Desperation does things to you. It makes you consider choices you'd never even think about under normal circumstances. It makes you swallow your pride. Which is how I found myself standing outside Ethan's office building one afternoon, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. I told myself I wasn't there to beg. I just needed. I didn't know. Closure? A chance to explain? Maybe part of me thought if I could just see him, I'd find some sliver of the man who used to love me. I waited outside for hours, hidden behind a row of parked cars. Watching. When Ethan finally emerged, he looked exactly the same and completely different. Confident. Put together. Like none of this had touched him at all. Like I had never mattered. He was with a woman. Not the one from the article, a different one. She was laughing at something he said, her hand brushing his arm casually. I felt like I was watching a stranger. He glanced in my direction once, briefly, as they crossed the street. Our eyes met. Just for a second. And then he looked away. No pause. No recognition. No reaction. It was like I didn't exist. I stood there long after they disappeared, my legs trembling, my chest hollow. I had come here hoping to find answers. Instead, I found the truth. Ethan wasn't angry. He wasn't heartbroken. He wasn't anything. I had spent years believing I was the one who held the power in our marriage. That Ethan would never be able to move on from me. But he had. Easily. Effortlessly. And I was nothing more than a footnote in his life. That night, I stared at myself in the cracked motel mirror. For the first time in a long time, I really looked at myself. The dark circles under my eyes. The hollow cheeks. The dullness in my gaze. I didn't recognize the woman staring back at me. She wasn't strong. She wasn't in control. She wasn't loved. She was just broken. I pressed my hands against the sink, my fingers trembling. Who are you? I whispered to my reflection. No answer. Just the silence I had created for myself. Because this was my doing. Ethan didn't ruin me. Daniel didn't ruin me. I did. I had built a life on lies, and when it collapsed, I had no one to blame but myself. The next morning, I packed my few belongings into a worn-out bag and checked out of the motel. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I had been hiding, hoping someone would come save me. But no one was coming. Ethan had moved on. Daniel had disappeared. My friends were gone. My family was done with me. There was no one left. No one but me. And it was time to face that. To face myself. Even if I didn't like what I saw when I left the motel, the sky was gray, thick clouds pressing down like they could crush me. Fitting. It matched the heaviness sitting in my chest, the kind that didn't go away with sleep, or food, or even tears. Not that I had much of any of those things lately. I didn't have a plan. No destination. No one waiting for me. Just the echoes of my own mistakes. For the first time in my life, I had to sit with myself. No distractions. No lies to tell. No one to manipulate or charm into giving me what I wanted. Just me. And it was unbearable. I ended up at a park on the edge of town, sitting on a bench that overlooked a small pond. The water was murky, still, reflecting a sky that seemed just as empty as I felt. I watched people pass by, parents with their kids, couples holding hands, friends laughing over coffee cups. Normal people. People who probably hadn't destroyed their own lives piece by piece. It was strange, really, how life kept going even when yours had fallen apart. The world didn't stop because you were drowning. I pulled my knees to my chest, resting my chin on them, and tried to remember the last time I'd felt anything real. Not excitement from sneaking around. Not the temporary high from Daniel's attention. Not the shallow satisfaction of getting away with another lie. But something real. The sad thing was, I couldn't. Even my memories of Ethan felt distant, like they belonged to someone else. The version of me who met him, fell in love with him, married him, she felt like a stranger. I'd been so busy chasing something more that I'd never stopped to realize I already had everything I needed. Until it was gone. And the worst part? I hadn't even fought for it. I'd let it slip through my fingers because I thought it would always be there. Because I thought he would always be there. But Ethan had been smarter than I gave him credit for. Smarter than me. And now, he was gone. The next few days blurred together. I drifted from place to place, sleeping in my car when I had to, scraping by on what little cash I had left. Every time I passed somewhere familiar, a coffee shop Ethan and I used to go to, the street where Daniel used to pick me up, I felt like I was walking through the ruins of my own life. It was all there, frozen in time, but I was invisible. Just a ghost. Eventually, even my car was gone. I came out of a gas station one morning, clutching the cheap coffee I could barely afford, and found an empty space where it had been. Repoed. Of course. I just stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where it used to be, feeling nothing. Because what was one more thing to lose? I'd already lost everything that mattered. It was around that time I started thinking about Ethan more. Not out of anger. Not out of hope. Just wondering. Was he happy? Did he ever think about me? Did he miss me, even for a second? I knew the answers. But the questions haunted me anyway. I'd replay moments in my head, random, insignificant memories that I hadn't thought about in years. The way he used to absent-mindedly hum while making coffee. The way his hand would instinctively find mine when we crossed the street. The small things. The things I never appreciated until they were gone. I wondered if he remembered them too. Probably not. He had moved on. I was the only one still stuck here, drowning in a life I had ruined. I hit rock bottom a few days later. It wasn't dramatic. No big breakdown. No final, crushing moment. Just me, sitting on a cold sidewalk outside a closed convenience store, staring at my reflection in the dark glass door. I didn't recognize myself. My clothes were wrinkled, dirty. My hair was a tangled mess. My face was hollow, tired. But it wasn't just the physical part. It was my eyes. There was nothing in them. No spark. No life. Just emptiness. I had been so sure I was the one in control all those years. So confident that I could have it all without consequences. But the truth was, I'd been lost for a long time. I just didn't realize it until there was no one left to pretend for. I sat there for hours, shivering, watching the sky turn from gray to black, wondering if this was it. If this was how it all ended. But it didn't. Because somewhere in the middle of that darkness, a thought crept in. A simple one. You're still here. It wasn't comforting. It wasn't hopeful. It was just a fact. I was still here. Alive. Breathing. And maybe, just maybe, that meant I had a chance to do something with what was left. Not to fix what I'd broken. Not to get Ethan back. Not to erase the mistakes. But to be someone again. Someone better. The next morning, I found a public library, cleaned myself up in the bathroom as best I could, and started looking for jobs. It was humiliating. I had no real skills. No impressive resume. Nothing that made me stand out. But I applied anyway. Because I was done hiding. Done waiting for someone to save me. Ethan had been right to leave. Daniel had been right to walk away. They owed me nothing. I was the one who had to figure this out. And maybe it was too late to fix my old life. But it wasn't too late to build a new one. Brick by brick. Even if it took forever. Even if no one cared. Because for the first time, I wasn't doing it for anyone else. Just me. And that was the day I finally understood what it meant to face the consequences of my own choices. Not with excuses. Not with blame. Just with the truth. I had lost everything. But I was still here. And somehow, that was enough. Starting over isn't glamorous. It's not some inspiring montage set to uplifting music. There's no magical turning point where everything suddenly clicks, and life feels meaningful again. It's slow. It's humiliating. And it's lonely. But I did it. Not because I found some deep well of strength inside me or had an epiphany that changed everything. No, I did it because there was no other option. When you hit rock bottom, you either stay there or you crawl out. And I was tired of drowning. I found a job at a small diner downtown, the kind of place I never would have stepped into back when my life was comfortable. The manager barely glanced at my flimsy resume before shoving an apron into my hands. The pay was terrible, the hours long, and the customers rude. But it was something. My first paycheck felt like both a victory and an insult, a tiny sum that couldn't even cover a decent apartment, but it was more than I'd had in weeks. I rented a small, grimy room in a rundown building where the walls were so thin I could hear my neighbor's TV all night. I didn't care. It was mine. I spent my days on my feet, wiping tables, pouring coffee, pretending not to care when customers snapped at me. And at night, I'd lie awake in that cramped room, staring at the ceiling, haunted by memories I couldn't erase. Ethan's face. Daniel's lies. My own reflection in the mirror, hollow and unfamiliar. The life I'd lost felt like a ghost, always hovering just out of reach, reminding me of everything I'd thrown away. But day by day, the ache dulled. Not because I stopped caring. But because I learned to live with it. Months passed like that. I didn't mark the days. I didn't count the time. But one afternoon, as I was wiping down a sticky booth, I glanced up and saw him. Ethan. He was standing by the door, holding a coffee cup from the counter, talking to someone. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. My chest tightened, my heart racing so hard I thought I'd pass out. I hadn't seen him since that day outside his office, the day he'd looked right through me like I was a stranger. And now, here he was. Looking exactly the same. But happier. Lighter. He laughed at something the woman next to him said, another woman, because of course there was. She was pretty in that effortless way, the kind of woman who didn't need to try too hard. They were standing close, not touching, but the comfort between them was obvious. It hit me like a punch to the gut. Not because I still wanted him. But because I realized he really had moved on. Completely. I didn't exist to him anymore. I could have disappeared off the face of the earth, and it wouldn't have made a difference to him. I wanted to run. To hide in the back until he left. But I didn't. I don't know why. Maybe because I'd spent so long hiding from my mistakes that I was tired of it. Or maybe because, deep down, I wanted him to see me. To really see me. So I kept wiping the table, my hands trembling slightly, forcing myself to breathe. After a few minutes, he glanced around the diner, and our eyes met. Just for a second. His expression didn't change. No surprise. No anger. No sadness. Nothing. And then he looked away, like I was just another face in the crowd. That hurt more than anything. Not his leaving. Not his silence. But the indifference. Because hate means you still matter. But indifference? Indifference means you're nothing. When he finally left, the ache in my chest was unbearable. I locked myself in the tiny bathroom, sliding down the door until I was sitting on the cold floor, trying to keep the sobs from escaping. It wasn't just about Ethan. It was about me. About everything I'd done. Everything I'd lost. I'd thought facing the consequences meant struggling to survive. But it was more than that. It was realizing that, after all the lies, the betrayal, the selfish choices, I didn't even deserve to be remembered. I had been erased from his life. Like I was never there. But here's the thing about hitting rock bottom. Once you've been there, you realize that even the worst pain doesn't kill you. It just becomes part of you. And eventually, you get up. You move on. Because what other choice do you have? I still work at that diner. Still live in that crappy little room. But I don't expect life to magically fix itself anymore. There's no redemption arc waiting for me. No dramatic reunion. No happy ending. Just me. Waking up every day. Doing the work. Living with the weight of my own choices. I see Ethan sometimes. In passing. At the grocery store. In the park. Once at a cafe, laughing with friends. And every time, it hurts a little less. Not because I've forgotten. But because I've accepted it. I don't get to be the main character in his story anymore. Hell, I don't even get to be a footnote. And that's okay. Because for the first time in my life, I'm not living for anyone else's story. Just my own. Even if it's small. Even if no one's watching. It's mine. And that's enough.